All right, folks. Well, welcome. My name is Jason Grillo. I'm the event director for AirMiners, and pleased to see so many people here for our you might say, inaugural uh, book club event. And we are going to start in talking about our CDR primer, a CDR primer that just got released recently. And we've got today several of the authors of that. But before we go any further, just to let you know, we are going to record this for people who aren't able to make it today and for others to view afterwards. So with that, I'm going to cede the floor to our host for today, Mr. Jonathan Sanchez.
It's John, but thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to the first book club for the CDR primer. Very exciting. Yeah, like Jason said, we're lucky enough to have the authors of chapter 1 here, Toli and Andrew, along with Jeremy, one of the head editors, and Johnny, who worked on the design for the book. So maybe, Jeremy, did you have a brief introduction to kick us off here?
Yeah, I can say a couple quick words and then probably hand it over to Toli and Andrew and Johnny. So I'll keep it brief. I'll say I'm Jeremy Freeman, Executive Director of Carbon Plan, an organization that thinks a lot about kind of data and science for carbon removal and climate solutions. And we care a lot about transparency and kind of public communication. My involvement in this, I really want to be clear, was midstream. So this project was really led by Jennifer Wilcox, who's incredible, and couldn't be here today. Maybe some saw the news. She has an exciting new appointment in the Biden administration. So she is now very busy. She was already busy, and we're really thrilled that she's doing that. So she really kind of led this effort. It started with a series of workshops that actually Andrew and Tully were at and can share more about. And that ultimately led to a very collaborative effort to get a lot of folks together to think about and ultimately try to write down a set of ideas and concepts around carbon removal and really prepare this primer as a way to teach the field and sort of teach broadly concepts, ideas, technical language, science, how to contextualize the science, how to contextualize the knowledge. And that process is really what led to this book. I got involved initially authoring as an author on one of the chapters, and then got increasingly involved in kind of pulling all the pieces together. And it was actually really the idea of Andrew and Tully to make this, what originally was intended to be a textbook, this kind of online digital resource. And a large part of the goal of that was making it freely available. And that's when Johnny got involved for Ordinary Things and got involved in producing this incredible online resource that sounds like you've all taken a look at. What I'll just say quickly is that really the theme and thrust of this resource is teaching that this is an incredibly diverse field. It brings together lots of different areas of science and lots of different areas of social science and policy. And we really see it as something that needs to be taught. And we want to kind of use this as an educational resource to bring people that are kind of interested in the field deeper in, to bring folks that are from really different fields into thinking about carbon removal and all the different aspects of it, and also make sure that kind of carbon removal is framed appropriately within the broader context of other climate change mitigation strategies. It's definitely not the only one. We really want to be clear about that. And that's an important conversation that honestly is still happening right now and is actually quite a current topic of debate, sort of how to think of CDR within the broader landscape of climate solutions. So we hope this book helps. It is a snapshot in time. It sort of represents a lot of expertise of a lot of individuals. That doesn't mean it gets everything right. There are still lots of complexities and controversies in this space. We hope at least the book frames some of those and helps kind of this next generation think through and understand these problems. So I think with that, I'll turn it over, if that sounds good, to Toli and Andrew, who can maybe kind of frame up the first chapter, which was written by them, and is a really fantastic kind of intro and framing for CDR as a whole.
Yeah, sorry, maybe before that, can we just hear from Johnny? Because I know we're going to talk to Toli and Andrew for a lot of the time. So maybe Johnny can tell us about the design a little bit quickly.
Johnny.
Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Just trying to skip me. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I think coming from not quite an outsider's perspective, but we're pretty keep up to date with all things climate. So we're very familiar with carbon removal and the need for it. But the perspective on the project is really like, realizing sort of how batshit crazy all this stuff is. Like, that we're, first of all, that we're in the position that we need to be doing this, and just like really understanding the amount of capital that's going to flow into it in the next 50 years, and that really the work that the book is sort of like outlining is not really going to like kick into like full speed until probably the end of my life, or hopefully sooner, but like it's just we're talking a long conversation here. And so our perspective with the design was to make sure that it's clear and communicates really well. That's the utmost importance. I think the design reflects that. But one of the things that Jen and Jeremy sort of led us to do was to come up with a design that was captivating, that really got people excited. That was something new that they hadn't seen. And one of the things from the project that I think I was just reviewing our materials, and we develop a tone words to help sort of guide how we want it to feel. And one of the tone words was like a touch of mad scientist. And I think that's like super appropriate for carbon removal as a whole, because it is like, we talked to a lot of people from different fields. I mean, from this field, doing, different like angles on it. And the shit that they come up with just blows my mind. I'm like, wait, so you're using, this compound to carbonate in the soil to do, and I'm just like trying to wrap my head around stuff. And so you'll notice on like the homepage and I think the chapter title pages, we are able to have a little bit of fun with some interactive elements, and try to bring a little bit of that excitement and almost like futuristic feeling to it, and a little touch of that mad scientist. So yeah, that's kind of some thoughts on the design. I'm happy to talk to anybody else about further questions if you have any.
I just want to highlight, it was just an absolute, we work with Johnny and Richard on a lot of our things at Carbon Plan, and it was just a thrill to work with them and Jen and the others on this book. I think a theme of this book really was collaboration, the fact that so many experts from so many different fields kind of came together to write it, and Johnny was just as much a part of that collaboration. I think having someone with true kind of design expertise think really clearly about how to communicate some of these ideas, even down to every single figure and every detail of every figure. We really talked through, what is this trying to convey? How does the visual language communicate that? And it was really, I just loved and found it so exciting and interesting to have that perspective be part of the conversation as we brought this thing into a cohesive whole.
And just to add to that, like the part of like the realization of like looking at science as a whole, as I have been for many years, is like I think something that Jen really understood is how important good design is to like communicate effectively, and to make it not only communicate well, but to be alluring to young people. She talked about how the people that are really going to be doing like the heavy lifting on this are like in high school and junior high right now, and so like getting those people to be excited about the science, the sort of visual element to it is just sort of kind of makes it more alluring and tantalizing, and just more exciting future. So I think I encourage everyone working in this field. I mean, of course, I'm biased as a designer, but I encourage everybody to to really think about design and take it seriously, because it is really, really important for any scientific endeavor to be successful. So yeah, I'll end it there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jeremy and Johnny. That was great. And I think we'll carry forth that mentality of a touch of mad scientist forward into the rest of the discussion.
Love it.
But Yeah, so at this point, Toli and Andrew, who actually wrote chapter 1, which is the focus of today's meeting, they've prepared brief framing to help us kick off the discussion. While they're talking, feel free to drop in the chat questions that you have for them or for the group, or just things that have been on your mind. We'll try to curate a good discussion from those questions, and then also towards the end, shift to breakout rooms if we have some time to discuss the chapter in a smaller group setting and dig into some of the details. But so I guess from here we'll pass it off to Toli and Andrew.
Sounds good. Hi everybody. My name is Toli. Andrew and I are both PhD students at Harvard University. Our regular kind of day-to-day research involves working on a new direct air capture method, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about the governance and broader implications of carbon dioxide removal. So as Jeremy said, if you can even call carbon dioxide removal a field, it is certainly an emerging field, and it's getting a lot more attention lately. So it's obviously important to make sure we get the science right, and that's a big thrust of the primer. Our chapter 1, sets up kind of the rest of the chapters that go into a lot more detail around science and engineering of the different approaches. But that said, we are also very aware of the fact that there are a lot of misconceptions and misuse of language and concepts around carbon dioxide removal. And certain sectors, especially we think polluting industries, fossil fuel industry, for example, has a big incentive to bury concepts in terms like low carbon oil or net zero. And so a big focus of our chapter especially is to tease that apart and help everyone understand sort of the distinctions in what is actually buried in those terms, which are sometimes used, deliberately in a misleading way. And beyond these polluting industries, for-profit interests also have kind of quite a bit of incentive to sell and make things look flashy. But we're trying to tease through that and sort of get everyone a clear picture of what this means. So I'll just quickly maybe summarize 2 parts of the primer, and then I'll let Andrew kind of wrap things up. On the language point, whether or not you buy and you adopt sort of the suggested language that we suggest about carbon dioxide removal, net negative, negative emissions, flux, stock, the concepts that are associated with them are important and are distinct. So, we have section 1.2 that really teases that apart. We particularly try to differentiate the difference between a CDR approach, something like direct air capture, from a CDR system, where without knowing in advance if your direct air capture will produce a net negative amount of removal of carbon, it's not actually that meaningful to just say here's a direct air capture and it's going to remove carbon. You actually have to prove that. And so we're trying to say, let's be really clear, you can't a priori assume that everything is going to be a net negative system, and that's hard with how we use language. And I'll actually jump a little ahead. I spent some time, I kind of led the carbon cycle section. I'll just quickly say, we spent a lot of time trying to get the climate science right, and the key concept there is feedback. So if you remove a meaningful amount of carbon from any of the climate reservoirs, you're going to affect all the other reservoirs. So that's kind of keep that in your head. So actually, if you remove CO2, 1 ton of CO2 from the air, you're actually going to release something back. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I'll hand it off to Andrew from here to wrap it up.
My mic hasn't been working that well. Can you all hear me? Okay, if it starts to go out, someone just jump in and yell at me, and then Toli can finish up. So, yeah, so I mean, the sort of, maybe in our mind, new result in our chapter, even though, as Toli and Jeremy said, a lot of the goal of this is to just communicate what's sort of, very well known and very well established to a small community, to a broader group of people. But one thing that we encountered in trying to do that was that it was really challenging to actually set the scale for how much carbon dioxide removal is needed, and even to understand what that means. And that's a very important question. It has a sort of potentially somewhat scientific answer, but it's really a political question, because what you need is very much based on what you do in other ways. If we had mitigated our emissions 100 years ago, we wouldn't need to do much. We wouldn't be that close to being on the precipice of a climate crisis or in one. And so this is really about what we choose to do and how we choose to do it, and what else is caused as a result. But there's a scientific sort of underpinning to that, which is that you can ask something about, at long times, what emissions we will not be able to avoid as a society. And even there, it's political, because what do we mean by not be able to? I personally want to make sure we keep feeding everyone. And so I would say that there are important social justice standards, food being an obvious one, but also things like being able to move freely around the world and being able to communicate, with loved ones, that sort of helps set those social justice standards. And then there's obviously physical constraints. There's certain things we just can't do. There's certain types of, emissions that will just be basically impossible to avoid. We can ask at very long time scales, what will that sort of big group of what we call hard to avoid emissions, but we sort of thought maybe would be better named, like almost unavoidable emissions or something like that. What would be that, the size of that category? And we want to have that like sort of live as a quantitative sort of almost scientific engineering number, acknowledging that there's also a big set of social justice related constraints there as well. But what we did is we set out to, so we didn't do anything new here, but what we did is we aggregated a lot of numbers from studies and from other sources, because we couldn't find that number anywhere. We spent a lot of the last year just being really frustrated, like, what the hell, where is this? And so what you can see here is that at very long time, we sort of picked 2100 as what we called long, but in theory, we mean something even potentially beyond that. Our tabulation is that we need 1.5 to 3.1 gigatons of CO2 to offset these hard to avoid emissions. It says CO2 equivalent here on what the actual hard to avoid emissions are, because actually it turns out that most of these come from nitrous oxide that are emitted as a result of agriculture. Do you want to flip down to that, Toli? So if that plot sort of sets out what we mean by long term and what we mean by offsetting these hard to avoid emissions, and for those of you who did read this, will be a summary. But here you can see that we try to really chisel down to what's really sort of properly hard to avoid. So you see that we have no electricity generation or power generation in general here. And that's because it's sort of well established that even though it will be tough from an engineering perspective, that if you sort of are cost agnostic, which is what we really tried to do here. We didn't ask what'll happen if we do this sort of with a market allocation, which again is an important political question. We said, what can we actually do physically? And it's well established that right now we have issues relating to grid scale storage. And we might need to use nuclear. We might need to use other things if we really want to be 100% clean in the electricity sector, but it's possible. So these are sort of the sectors that we identified from speaking with folks and from doing a lot of digging that potentially will have some hard to avoid emissions remaining. Although you can see we even have zeros for both shipping and heating, which is to say that it is quite possible that we can even avoid those. So yeah, that's kind of the high level picture on how we came to these numbers. For context, for those of you who aren't as deep in the climate world, I just for some more context, we emit more than 40 gigatons of CO2 per year, or CO2 equivalent. CO2 equivalent is even more, but CO2 is even more than 40 as a globe, which is to say, this is something on the order of 5% of that. Many of the other studies that try to, so they don't talk about a need for CDR, but they talk about how much CDR we will expect to do, come from the integrated assessment model literature. And that literature, maybe we can stop screen sharing and then we can come back to this later if you have questions. That literature is not saying what the need is, but it's actually making a very political sort of claims about market allocation. But then is often sort of cited in various CDR studies, and that kind of causes confusion because a lot of those folks who cited are not IAM experts. And so what you see is in some of these really great reports that have been really foundational, that I don't mean to denigrate because they're very important, they sort of assume some stuff from the IAM literature as a sort of just conclusion up front. And so even the National Academies of Sciences Negative Emission Technologies report, which I imagine many of you have seen, it has a conclusion up front. They call it a conclusion that we'll need to do 10 gigatons of CDR by mid-century and 20 by the end of the century, which is enormous. You know, in comparison, it's you know, half of what we do globally in emissions, but it's also just large in terms of how we can imagine getting there. And so there's just a variety of great stuff that we cite in our chapter, because we're really just aggregating, that talks about the moral hazards of essentially doing that and then not reducing emissions, avoiding our emissions, and then being stuck in a place where we're still, you know, heading right towards climate change, barreling towards it. And then also all of the horrible things that we might entrench when we continue to use fossil fuels if we go down those paths. So there are these ethical considerations that need to be weighed heavily because, you know, not just burning fossil fuels, but extracting them is very harmful to people's health and well-being. It goes into streams, goes into the air. So that's something that we cover a lot in this chapter, and I'm happy to answer more questions about it. Just pivoting there to our sort of last section around social justice, which, you know, Tully and I are by no means experts in, but we wanted to make sure we talk about the social justice implications and cite some other people's great work, especially Holly Jean Buck's on the sort of social justice sort of potential and ramifications of doing CDR. I think it's worth just noting, we talk about a few things there, but one thing that I kind of just want to mention is now we're about to have a Department of Energy that takes this very seriously and is probably going to spend a lot of money on this. And, you know, I think I'm excited about that, but I think we also need to think about what can potentially go wrong and how we should think about it. And for me, there's been a bunch of good actually threads on Twitter in the last few days following up on our primer, which I've been excited about. I think governance goes hand in hand with technology, and that's something we wanted to get across in this primer. So I am very excited about developing technologies to impact climate change, and I think we can. But you know, no technology lives in a vacuum, and you know, governance always is part of the system, you know, just as much as that technology. And so the idea, I think, that we should just spend a lot and not be worried where it goes, and not be worried if it goes to fossil fuel companies who might not be interested in working on climate change, or even, you know, to folks who are but might seek to profit from it. I don't think we should let that just happen without interrogating it and asking, are there other things we can do? Can it go to, you know, publicly governed municipal projects, or can it go to a variety of other sources? These things have been piloted for other types of things. You know, French nuclear is a big example, and we do this in the U.S. as well. We have a lot of publicly owned power generation facilities, but we sort of aren't yet asking exactly what that could look like for carbon dioxide removal, and for technological carbon dioxide removal like DAC specifically. So anyway, we just touch on that in our chapter, but very interested in hearing what folks think, and we hope to be digging into it and writing more about it too. But anyway, yeah, that's a good start, I think.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that was great. And thank you both for the introduction. So what I'm sort of picking up on, and by looking at the questions in the chat, there's sort of three topics that people are focused on. One is scale and how much CDR do we actually need, then carbon cycle questions, and finally about the social justice framing. So maybe we could try to spread the questions out amongst those three bigger topics. Maybe I saw Joy just posted a question here at the bottom about moral hazards. Appreciate. Was that a question? We can move on. Do you want to address moral hazards, or should we move on to something else?
I mean, maybe we can just say, yeah, there's a few great sort of chunks of the literature to draw from that we point to. So, I mean, we really did mean this to be a primer, in that if you are like, what is moral hazard? We have like several things we cite. that, you know, if you're interested, I really recommend digging into. So there's some great pieces by Glenn Peters, and this is all within section 1.4 if you want to sort of narrow what you're looking at. And then there's a couple of other pieces of literature led by Sabine Fuss that we point to that really get into the moral hazards and the ethical considerations that go even beyond sort of some of these basic moral hazards. But you can just very simply, as a thought experiment, ask, you know, if we have a particular level we want to get to of our net emissions, you know, we might say, oh, well, great, we're going to do a lot of CDR. And so that's negative. And that means we don't have to reduce or avoid as much of our positive emissions. And if it was that easy, you know, then we might be able to sort of solve climate change without a lot of, you know, a lot of tough decisions. But unfortunately, we have no idea how quickly this is going to scale. And I think we need to just be really careful about that. So I think one of the main things is just to ask, when we are sort of assuming that, yeah, and sorry, there's this Lindsay paper that I forgot to mention as well. When we're assuming that things are going to scale quickly and that they're going to scale without other harms, which I don't think is fair, and we sort of just look at like, oh, minus plus plus gets to 0, we leave a lot out. And a lot of the moral hazards live in what we leave out there, and what we potentially entrench societally if we don't ask those tough questions. So I'm sure people here have a lot of you know, bones to pick in that analysis, and there's a lot of debate. So happy to talk about it, but that's kind of the broad overview.
Maybe one tiny thing to add to that, I just to make a kind of zoom out and make a very high level point. I think what's so valuable about what Andrew and Tully have done in this chapter, and something I would just encourage everyone in this group to be kind of, you know, self-critical about and really think carefully about, is really what we mean when we say, you know, we need to do CDR. It's actually really complicated. And I think they did a great job explaining why it's complicated. And, you know, it's all over the place right now. And there's actually just in the last few days on Twitter, lots of discussion and debate on exactly this topic. And I think what I would encourage everyone to do is every time you see a report or a tweet or, you know, a politician saying we need to do 10 to 20 gigatons of CDR, that's not just sort of a fact of the world. That's not on its own science. That is a conclusion or an assumption or a sort of weird mix of both that comes from a particular way of looking at the problem. And that's not the only way to look at the problem, and it could be a problematic one. In particular, most of the time that those claims of, say, you know, 10 to 20 have been made, you know, that's basically the output of a model that sees a world in which it can adjust the relative amounts of lots of different ways to try to accomplish certain temperature targets, and they have costs associated with them, and that's to some extent baked into the model. And the models make choices that ultimately result sometimes in some of those models in doing certain amounts of CDR. The fact that those models ended up making or coming to that conclusion is not sort of scientific evidence that we need to do that amount of CDR. It's saying that there is a particular future in which things, or just under a certain set of assumptions, that is the amount of CDR that achieves a certain target. So this doesn't tell you the answers, but it tells you to be really thoughtful and nuanced and critical whenever you see people talk about we need to do this or we need to do that. Those numbers all have meanings and they come from places, and we should think carefully about where they come from.
And if I just jump in, John, to connect just what Jeremy said to the question that Julia just asked in chat, that's to say that these IAMs don't talk about hard to avoid emissions. And most of the literature on IAMs is very aware of this. So I don't mean to like necessarily, you know, take a shot at them. They're basically doing a different project. And their project really is much more political. I think the economists would, the ones I've spoken to at least, agree with that. I think they would most all agree with that. They're really asking, you know, in our current world where we allocate things based on cost, like Jeremy said, what do we get to for CDR? But that's not about requirement. That's about particular trade-offs in a market-based system. And we may choose to, you know, prefer that or not. But even within the IAMs, what's important is that there's a huge amount of variation, massive. And so on the top end, 20 gigatons of CDR sometimes gets thrown around, and that's what shows up in these reports, because, you know, it's often CDR folks who want to say, look how much we need, which is, you know, for those of you who are scientists or write grants, you know that that's a tendency. But on the other hand, there are some of these IAM results that go down very low. None really go down to this 3.1 number. or the 1.5 to 3.1 number, but they go down to like, the 4, 5, 6 gigaton range. And that, again, that's not saying that those are hard to avoid emissions. It's just saying that's a world in which we avoid a lot of other emissions, and CDR is also projected to be expensive for a variety of reasons, or because a lot of CDR comes from land is expected to be constrained, et cetera. So there's just like so many assumptions that go into the IAMs, and it's not asking about a sort of baseline ground truth about CDR requirement. And so that's the difference. This sort of top-down versus bottom-up approach differentiates them in that regard.
The part that is straightforward, straightforward. the part that you might say is kind of objectively, quote unquote, sort of science, from the pure perspective of the climate system, we can say pretty concrete things about, the effect of CDR, of a certain amount of CDR on global temperature, and the effect of a certain amount of decarbonization or mitigation on global temperature. Those relationships are kind of reasonably modeled and pretty straightforward. Among many papers, there's a recent model from Henry Drake and co-authors called Margot, which tries to sort of really boil down to the essentials, a simple way of talking about those relationships. Again, there are well-described relationships between carbon dioxide concentrations and carbon removal and mitigation and global temperature. That's well described. But anytime you start talking about how much of any of those things we need to do, that's when you're entering the realm of making very complicated and probably wrong assumptions about how much things cost, and you're bringing a value system about sort of what we should do when and why it matters.
Awesome. That was great discussion. Maybe a related point, but that I'm getting a few questions in DMs and also that are showing up here about are sort of tied to carbon cycles questions. So one question I'm getting is about the difference between removing a ton of CO2 and emitting a ton of CO2, and how that equivalence works when there are such crazy carbon cycle feedbacks that are also at play. That sort of affect those emissions and removals. And then another question by DA that just got put in the chat that's sort of related, which is, given those sort of interactions, how much CDR is actually needed if we wanted to do active removal and go below 350 ppm. So all sort of carbon cycle questions, but maybe you could address that.
I could take a first shot at those questions. And actually, just to connect it to the IAM discussion, I think one thing to caution is that it is actually sometimes very confusing to interpret IAM results, because they will sort of hide whether something is negative emissions versus CDR. So for example, if you displace aviation fuels with bioenergy, you actually need to pull down CO2 from the air. You're growing crops, so those are negative emissions. But then you burn them in an airplane, so you re-emit them. And essentially that's the same thing as, you're doing CDR, but then you take it and burn it. So it's just important to track what we're actually talking about. From the carbon cycle perspective, I could actually just share my screen because we have a schematic that addresses a lot of these points. But the idea is essentially, you have, at a high level, think about these four reservoir systems: atmosphere, land, ocean, and geological. You can see that there are connections between them in this way. And again, this is quite a simplified representation, but it is asking about these entire reservoirs. And so if you look at kind of panel B, you can say, all right, what happens when we just take things from the geological, so like coal or oil, and we put it into the atmosphere? Well, because that atmosphere is actually in exchange with the land and the ocean, some of the CO2 that we emit will actually be absorbed into oceans and absorbed into the land sink. A rough heuristic is just for every 4 molecules of CO2 that you emit, one goes into the land, one goes into the ocean. So the ocean and the land are doing a lot of work for us. If it wasn't for those sinks, which is not a very meaningful point, but if it wasn't for those things, like the emissions that we would have done in the last like several hundred years, would be twice as much. So basically think about it in the inverse when we do talk about negative emissions. So if you remove a unit of CO2 from the atmosphere, the ocean and the land now kind of fill that gap and return, I guess, to take a look at D over here, and return some carbon into the atmosphere and into the ocean. Now this is a very simplified schematic, and it changes over time. So, you know, this response over 10 years versus 100 versus 1,000 years will be very different, but it's quite useful conceptualization if you just talk about the next 100 years and think about it that way.
Cool. And then just to touch on DA's question, like how does the number of 1.5 to 3.1 gigaton CO2 per year change if we decide to not just hit net zero, but to also like try to reestablish 350 ppm?
Yeah, I think there's another question in the chat, I think, about this as well, yeah, it's really about what our climate targets are, I guess. And I think that's also, you know, I think needs to be sort of addressed and recognized as a very political question. And so there's actually something that we didn't do quite enough sort of to sort of go into it in the primer. But I think another question you could ask actually is the inverse to this question. And I can explain why I'm more interested in that one maybe, which is, what if we only want to hit 2C or 2.5C? And not 1.5C, which is to say, not because I want to, I don't want us to have to experience climate change at all, but if we acknowledge that some of the tough decisions we'll make when we reduce emissions will fall on, you know, probably predominantly the global South, because those are the folks that haven't had, you know, a century worth of emissions to sort of build up their standard of living. And if we don't take a global view and try to reallocate wealth and resources, they won't get to build up that standard of living by doing what a lot of the global North has done historically. And that, you know, at the international level, that's been considered. Paris, you know, considers that quite a bit as well. I'm not an expert on the international policy side of things, so other people might be better informed than me. But what I can say is, assuming you then don't try to hit 1.5C and you just ask for 2C, I was sort of getting at this before. If a century ago we had determined we didn't, you know, we had some way of not emitting as much, or we decided to think more sustainably, we wouldn't be right up against, you know, catastrophic warming right now. And we might not need CDR even if we wanted to hit 1.5C. CDR is something that we're kind of using to offset these hard to avoid emissions because we believe that we basically need to get to net zero given the carbon budget we have, or at least one might say that. But if our carbon budget is bigger, then we might actually not need to offset hard to avoid emissions, or at least not do it anytime soon. Maybe we don't need to do it for another 200 years. So that's to say that even if we want to get to net zero eventually, as long as that eventually is quite far away, we might not need to offset, we might not need any CDR anytime soon. Now, if you sort of have the opposite opinion, you say, well, we really need to get back to 350. I would say personally, I would caution us, or at least I'm curious to hear what the justification is, because I think there will be hardship for so many on Earth if we set for really sort of go back to that number. But I'm open to it. I'm not an expert, so I'm not saying we shouldn't ask that question. But I will then say, yes, our CDR will probably need to do more, because we will need to do more than just offsetting hard to avoid emissions. We'll definitely need to do more. And then there's a question of scale up and cost that we would put into that, that becomes much larger and much more challenging to discuss.
Okay, thank you. And maybe we want to leave some time for breakout rooms, but maybe one more question that's related to this whole discussion, and then maybe there's a way for people to get in touch if they still have questions on the chapter and want to maintain the conversation. But the one question I thought was relevant is that rate of return for the carbon cycle dependent on the technology of choice that or like what specific CDR strategy you're using and how the CO2 is removed, or is it a pretty fixed equilibrium?
Well, actually, Jeremy's probably even better suited to talk about this than I am, but it certainly depends on I would say what and how you store the CO2. I would think about it that way, not necessarily, you know, the exact mechanism that you remove it from the air, although they're related. If a tree removes it, then that is also the storage. But, you know, I would think about it as where is the CO2 coming from and where is it going? And if you store the CO2 in top surface of soil, it's very different than if you shove it underground in geologic formations. And especially if one conceptual way to think about the difference is, have you done an operation where once you've stored it, you don't have to think about it and you know it's removed, versus have you done an operation where you need an ongoing maintenance of that to make sure that the CO2 doesn't return. So if you're maintaining a forest and it burns down, the CO2 comes up. Or if you're maintaining a soil field with a bunch of carbon in it, but you change your practices, then the carbon can come back right away. That's not the same thing as when I dump a bunch of CO2 deep underground. Jeremy, you should add to that.
Yeah, no, that was great, Tully. And just to add, this is and I see another question from Catherine, it looks like. Really critical point, and something there's a really nice table on in chapter 1 that we all worked on. We often use the word permanence or durability to think about this. So, you know, exactly as Tully said, strictly in terms of, you know, the molecule, from the molecule of CO2's perspective, whether it came, you know, down through capture by a sorbent or it ended up in plant biomass via, you know, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis, doesn't really matter. What does matter is the kind of duration or durability or permanence over which that CO2 is stored. And this is actually one of the biggest ways in which a lot of the conversations we see happening right now, where people talk about sort of tons of CDR, not all tons are not the same. And there's a major difference between, say, a ton of CO2 or a molecule of CO2, you know, a ton of CO2 captured through direct air capture and then reacted, and with subsurface minerals. In that case, that CO2 is out of the atmosphere forever. It's effectively precipitated into some kind of rock, and it's going to be there effectively permanently. I mean, we can talk about geological timescales, but in general, that's out of the atmosphere for good. In contrast, any system or any form of CDR that involves biological systems has a far shorter permanence. And there's two different forms that could limit, or ways in which permanence could be limited. One is physical. So anytime you have CO2 stored in a biological system, like an ecosystem, forest, plants, trees, soil, there's risk of physical disturbance, could burn down, trees could die through insects or drought, plants decompose, CO2 ends up back in the atmosphere. That could be on the order of 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. That's really different than effectively permanent or 1,000-year storage. And in some fundamental sense, it's worse, because remember, the CO2 we emit into the atmosphere is effectively creating a permanent problem, because the effects of that CO2 last for thousands of years. So we can't compensate for something that has an 1,000-year timescale by doing something that has a 50-year timescale. That they are not the same thing. The other challenge with biological systems as a form of CDR is that there are also risks that do not involve kind of physical disturbance, but involve what you might say is called sort of socioeconomic risks. So if, say some change to soil management practices increases the amount of carbon in the soil, that relies on someone continuing to do that and make that change to their management practice for the duration over which you want that increased soil carbon to be there. If they stop doing it, if you stop paying them, or for whatever reason, if they go bankrupt, they abandon their farm, you don't get that benefit anymore. So any system where there's kind of a human risk, a risk to the fact that someone's practices might change or result in that carbon being lost again, is a major limitation to those systems. So permanence, we think of is one of the fundamental kind of metrics by which to think about different CDR systems. And the table in the chapter is a good job at kind of framing what permanence looks like across a bunch of different methods.
Awesome. Well, thanks to Jeremy, Andrew, and Tully for answering questions. And I see that, round of applause for them. That was awesome.
Great questions.
I see
for
that
being
Andrew,
here, everyone. It's great questions. Very much appreciated.
I see that Andrew and Tully put their email addresses in the chat. So feel free to hit them up if you have further questions. And Jeremy now too. Awesome. Yeah, we figured some time to decompress and chat in breakout rooms would be good to synthesize everything and to meet other people and have some conversations about the chapter. So I think Jason has set up breakout rooms for the discussions. The one thing we'd say is that given that we're sort of low on time, it's probably best to not spend time on intros and just get into talking about the chapter maybe. And maybe, start off with like, what did you think of the chapter? What are your thoughts coming out of the discussion? And, what further questions do you have? Awesome. Well, yeah, let's do that. Thanks everyone for coming. Next week, we got chapter 2. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
Great, same time, same place. Great, so coming into breakout rooms now. So join the breakout room when it comes on your screen.
And John, I just